recognized as a very valid means for personal identification. He is 29.
To all the loyal audience here, I'd like first of all to welcome you here to Orange County. I'm Larry Regal, and in the event you don't know me, I'm the director of the Orange County's Forensic Science Services. Tonight, we're going to relive history, we're going to study today, and we're going to dream of the future. But I thought it might be fun if we started out with a little quiz. First of all, I know some of you read the program and you probably remember it, but most of you probably didn't. So I don't want anybody to yell out the answer or to give anybody else a hint for this quiz. It'll be a silent quiz. We have 3 speakers, and of course we have 3 subjects. And what I want you to do, just with a couple of hints that I'm going to give you, try to match up the speaker to the subject. That's the quiz. These are the hints. The first subject is history. The speaker, one of these 3 people, is history. He really is. He has done it all, and he can remember everything, and he can tell you everything about criminalistics. It's not since cassette tapes were first introduced to the public. He has recorded every meeting, every conversation, and every phone call if you've ever phoned him. And I'm sure he still does. The second subject today, the speaker speaking on today, is most appropriate because he really doesn't remember anything about the past. And he has no future. Now, wait a minute. That is not meant to be mean. Now, when I say he has no future, and this is the big hint, where he comes from, mañana never comes. That's a hint. You'll never do any better on that. Okay, the future. This speaker is indeed a dreamer, and he is always pointing ahead. In fact, when he speaks, his head shines out about all the other crowd. Okay, those are the hints. Now, it's your turn to answer. But again, the answer is silent. Now, on history, if you have answered Walter Jack Cadman, you're absolutely right. Everybody get Walter Jack Cadman? Raise your hand if you got it right. I'd like to introduce Jack right now, but before, I'd like to give you just a little idea of the format of this program. We're going to, first of all, have each speaker on each subject. They're going to take about 10 minutes. They promised 10 minutes, which means about 35 for each subject. And at the conclusion of that, we're going to open it up to questions. And I'll moderate those questions. If they're too difficult for any of the speakers to answer, I will answer them. Jack Cadman, graduate of UC Berkeley. Like many of us, when he graduated from the School of Criminalistics up there was no job in the crime laboratory. So his first job was a prisoner, a guard. Freudian slip, Jack. He was a guard who guarded prisoners at Chino Prison. As a matter of fact, I understand he is responsible for the security measures at Chino Prison that are still in effect today, at least up until last week. In 1948, he was hired, and at that point originated the Orange County Sheriff's Crime Laboratory, and it has grown to what it is today. And quite honestly, it would not be what it was without the inspiration of Jack and all of his guidance over the years. He's a charter member of the CAC. He was, in fact, the second executive secretary, which is equivalent to the president of today. I asked him, in all honesty, what his most memorable moment in his whole life of criminalistics was in just last week, and he did mention it was the day that he hired me into the lab. In fact, I think really his most memorable moment is that he did receive the very prestigious award, the Roger Green Award. And some of you may not know what that is, but it is an award from this association to an individual who is outstanding in this field. Roger Green was the first criminalist at the CI&I lab, DOJ lab, Sacramento. I'd like to introduce at this time for our first speaker, Jack Cadman.
Thank you, Larry. I brought a few notes along tonight. We'll try to get through these in 10 minutes. Actually, when faced with the problem of trying to cover the history of the CAC in 10 minutes' time, my immediate response was that it couldn't be done. However, after some consideration and in an attempt to bring this audience the best possible message, I decided, instead of giving a history of the CAC, to first call your attention to the fact that this is almost, well, it's just past, the historic date of the first meeting of what was to become the California Association of Criminals. It was Lowell Bradford, then the director of the Santa Clara County Crime Laboratory, who called the first meeting. At that first meeting that Brad called, we were attempting to find out as much as possible about what everyone else in the state was doing. Several points should be made. Those days, there was very little instrumentation. There were very few crime laboratories. There was a problem in communication. So our premise in meeting was an attempt to share information, to learn about the techniques and what was going on in the state. I think it's appropriate to give you some background before I talk any more about the meeting. It's now 8:29. With 10 minutes, I should be through by 8:30.
You've had 3 already.
Oh, have I? Really? The Los Angeles Police Department at that time had one of the first crime laboratories in the nation. It had been established while August Vollmer was the acting chief of police for that city. This was during the years 1923-24, July to July. The first person hired was a man by the name of Rex Welch. Rex Welch had a degree from Stanford University in chemistry, I believe. He had then gone to the University of Southern California, where he had obtained a degree in dentistry. And at that time, of course, forensic odontology was not called that, but it had been recognized as a very valid means for personal identification. So, for that reason, Rex Welch had been hired. He was a dentist and he had a chemistry background. One of the 2 persons hired subsequently, approximately 1928 or 29, was a man by the name of Ray Pinker. Ray Pinker was a graduate pharmacist from USC. The reason Ray was hired was that even in spite of the fact that narcotics were not the problem then that they are today, they needed someone who could examine pharmaceutical materials. Ray Pinker then became a person who was self-taught, not only able to identify narcotics and toxic substances, but Ray's many and diverse interests included many things which are today in the province of the generalist. He was good at microscopy. Trace evidence included, of course, firearms, tool marks. Ray had a lifelong hobby in electronics. Of course, it was vacuum tubes in those days instead of silicone chips. Blood and breath alcohol, serology, crime scene reconstruction, emission spectrography, bombs and explosives, to name but a few of the areas that Ray developed expertise in. He testified in most of the jurisdictions in Southern California in those days. He was a civilian, and so the police department did allow Ray to take outside cases, which meant that he had testified from Santa Barbara to San Diego and was recognized as the leading proponent of what was to become known as criminalistics in those days. Most of the laboratory in those days, most of the working persons were police officers who were selected from the ranks. The policy was established early on that there would be a police officer in charge of the laboratory. That policy still holds today. As time progressed, Ray used these on-the-job trained sworn personnel, and among these people who assisted Ray was a Lieutenant Lee Jones. Ray, of course, trained Lee. Lee's particular area of expertise was that of print and imprint evidence. He made a classic case where the victim of a hit and run struck a car in such a way that she left a lip print on the hood of the car, which is a classic in terms of identification for that day. The very first meeting then included Ray Pinker and Lee Jones, and both made contributions which we'll attempt to get to later. Paul Kirk obtained his bachelor's and master's degrees in chemistry from Ohio State University. He received a PhD in biochemistry at the University of California at Berkeley in 1927. Back as early as 1916, August Vollmer, who had started off as a mailman in Berkeley, subsequently become the marshal for the city, later to become chief of police, had become interested in the subject area of crime and the possibility of what were to become known as crime laboratories to be used in solving crimes. Summer session courses were started in 1916. In 1928, August Vollmer and Professor Kidd, who was incidentally a professor of law, proposed the establishment of a school of criminology. In 1931, a criminology program was established in the regular university curriculum. Paul Kirk was not the first head of that program. A Professor Schmidt headed it at first. Kirk was at that time a budding young professor, but in 1931, Schmidt turned the criminalistics, or what was to become known as the criminalistics program, over to Paul Kirk. And a criminology program was established in the regular university curriculum as opposed to these summer session courses. The technical criminology program then actually began in 1937. From that time on, Kirk began to assume an increasingly important role as a leader in the field. It was Kirk who suggested the change in title from technical criminology to criminalistics. This was 1947. He also defined and described the concepts of individualization in papers that were presented earlier. Roger Green was another attendee. Roger Green was another University of California Berkeley student. He was a chemistry graduate who was appointed to the California State Division of Criminal Identification and Investigation in August 1931, commonly referred to as CII. There'd been some work in documents and firearms identification prior to that time, but Roger Green was the first person to be given the title of chemist and ballistics expert. As a student, he attended the first course in microanalysis that Kirk had taught at UC Berkeley. David Byrd graduated in technical criminology in 1942. When Roger Green went on military leave in 1942, David Byrd was hired to replace him for the duration of World War II. Byrd was only the second person hired by the State Crime Laboratory. When Roger Green returned, Byrd was retained. Crime had grown in the interim. On the Ides of March 1947, there was an explosion on a yacht in Newport Harbor. This was to become known as the Overall Yacht Murder. The case was sensationalized, international coverage. The case was so sensational that the Attorney General of the state of California decided to take over the prosecution of the case, which he has a right to do under the law. Roger was dispatched to Orange County, where he worked with Ray Pinker on putting together the physical evidence in that murder case. It was during this period of time, while he was working with Ray Pinker and developing the physical evidence on that yacht murder, that still another one of the members of the CAC to become got into the field. That was Lowell Bradford, who assisted Dave Byrd in Roger's absence for the period of time that Roger was tied up with the investigation and subsequently the development of the case. For the defense, there was an expert from Pasadena who had started a crime laboratory there in the city of Pasadena as an undergraduate at Caltech. This was William W. Harper. Harper had become known as a forensic physicist. Bill was, in fact, so well known and doing so well that he couldn't afford to work full-time for the city of Pasadena, so he took them on a part-time consulting basis and launched into a career of doing defense work in those areas of his expertise. It was Bill Harper who was called in by the defense in the Overall yacht murder. It was later on decided by the city of Pasadena that they needed someone full-time instead of this part-time consulting work that had been carried by Bill Harper, and so Don Harding, another name at the first meeting, came into the picture because Don Harding was hired to fill the position of criminalist with the Pasadena Police Department. Don Harding was another UC Berkeley graduate under Paul Kirk. Harding left Berkeley in 1948 to become the first criminalist in Long Beach, California Police Laboratory. His position was not funded for the second year for a reason too lengthy to go into here. He subsequently went to the state of Wisconsin, where he worked for a period of time until the position in Pasadena opened up. Don was another one of the attendees of the first meeting of the group that was to become the CAC. John Davis. John was another graduate of the University of California at Berkeley. John had, before entering the program at Berkeley, taken a course by the Institute of Forensic Science in Chicago, a fingerprint organization, so that he had a background not only in fingerprints but firearms and other areas taught by correspondence, and he came to Berkeley as a fairly sophisticated young man who was eager to study this field of technical criminology. John left for temporary position with the state of Missouri. He filled a spot which had been filled up by John Williams. John Williams had been called into the service during World War II. John Davis filled his spot until John Williams returned, at which time John Davis returned to California and had started the Oakland Police Department Crime Laboratory. I could go into many other aspects of our original group. I see that I've run short on time. I can pick this up at a later point in case there are questions on it, but seeing that I've now exceeded my time, I'll turn over the meeting at this time to Joe Orantes. Sure. Is that what it's about? Watch
I'd hope nobody would tip anybody off as to our next speaker, but I guess by now, everybody who agrees the next speaker is going to be Joe Orantes. Raise their hand. It looks like everybody had a pretty good idea anyway before Jack let it slip out. Actually, Joe will be speaking on today, and then Joe is a graduate of that place he mentioned a couple of times there, UC Berkeley. But what a lot of people don't realize is that Joe started out his career also like a lot of us, not in criminalistics, but he found no job opportunities. And he was a narcotic investigator, an undercover investigator for the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, is that right? For 1 year. And he actually was the prototype, the image that they used to create the program Hawaii Five-0. His original role was called Tijuana Dose. In 1957, he did go to San Diego. He was hired to work along with Wayne Burgess in the San Diego Police Department laboratory, and he's been there ever since. I talked to Joe last week, and he told me that his claim to fame is that he was not selected to be on the Monitor TV program about crime laboratories. So, Joe, your turn.
He thinks it's one of those things you throw up and catch on the end of the day.
I hope this TV program is in color because I look best in color. I probably have the most difficult presentation to make to you, which is on what's going wrong today. I'm going to be very honest. Some of you may not agree with some of the comments I'm going to make. Feel free to step outside and we'll but I'm going to make them. First of all, crime labs today have a bad image in the eyes of the public and in the eyes of the criminal justice system. And I think most of you would agree with me on that. Some labs have poor reputations with prosecutors and the courts. The defense community does not trust the results obtained from certain labs. The news media depicts today's crime lab in a very negative way, as was shown recently on a TV program Monitor. Helter Skelter did not do justice to crime scene investigation. Proficiency studies, such as those conducted by the American Academy of Forensic Science Foundation, indicate that the quality of forensic services is poor. What's wrong with today's crime labs? I'm sure that question is in the minds of all of you. As was stated to me by Larry Regal over an excellent dinner in Oceanside a week ago, he put it very clearly, as Larry can. He said, there are some labs that are great. There are some labs that could be great. And there are some labs that are never going to be great. Now, what I'd like to ask all of you is, which one of those labs do you work for? Think about that. Most criminals believe that the main cause for today's quality problems in criminalistics is the lack of money. I don't agree with that. However, the claim is that there's insufficient funds for staffing, not enough people to do the work. We don't have the equipment to do the work. There's no training funds. There's no time or staffing for research. And above all, there's not enough room to do our work in. How many of you are working in very cramped spaces right now? Probably most of you would raise your hands. Now, I indicated to you earlier, I don't believe that this is the main problem with the crime labs today. But I'll tell you what I think is the main problem. I think what we need to do is to work more efficiently and more effectively with what we have. And I think that that responsibility lies on the crime lab managers. But I want to look at some of the obstacles that we are encountering today in trying to attain quality in criminalistics. And I'm going to steal a little bit from Lowell Bradford in an article that he wrote and presented to the Academy of Forensic Sciences. And although I am stealing from him, I'm also adding my own caustic comments. To begin with, crime scene processing. It's been my experience in the 26 years that I've been in the field that quite often in major cases, not enough evidence is collected. And if you can't get the evidence into the laboratory, obviously you cannot do your job. On the other hand, sometimes too much evidence is collected. In San Diego, we call that the Beacons Company. The people that go out and pick up everything in the damn house and bring it in for examination. Today, we are required, if it's collected, to examine it. This really taxes our resources. There has to be a more selective way of collecting evidence. Quite often, evidence is collected, maybe not necessarily in a major case, and it may not be collected by the crime lab, but it's never submitted. It's collected but never submitted when it should have been. And again, evidence is collected and submitted when it's not necessary. The individual, there's 3 witnesses to the crime, he's confessed to it. There's no need to examine the evidence, and yet we spend time, or I should say we waste time examining that evidence. Our resources are limited. We have to use them properly. We cannot afford to be wasting them. Another problem that I have found, not necessarily in my operation, but in other operations, is that the evidence collection units are not assigned to the laboratory. Therefore, they have no control over them and have no way of correcting any problems that may come up with the collection of evidence. There's lack of training in crime scene processing. You have a situation quite often where you have sworn personnel collecting evidence as opposed to civilian personnel, and both of them can do it equally well. However, with sworn personnel, quite often, they are assigned to that task without any training, and they are rotated out very frequently. Also, there's a way that police departments have of putting the most inept police officers in areas where they shouldn't, where they will do the least amount of harm, which is like in the crime lab or in an evidence collection unit. So you do not always get the best people to do that type of work, which I think is extremely important for the success of a crime laboratory operation. One thing that I find lacking in just about every jurisdiction is the ability to reconstruct crime scenes from the evidence found at the crime scene. This is important in trying to determine the intent of the criminal, trying to determine the degree of the crime. People go out and collect evidence and do not pay attention to trying to figure out what happened. And this is very lacking in our field today. Something else that I think may shock you coming from me, because I have worked for a law enforcement agency for a long time, is the lack of a timely crime scene processing by defense experts. We have, on a few occasions, given the opportunity to defense experts to come in and examine a crime scene shortly after the crime has been committed. And I think this is beneficial in the long run because it relieves the prosecution from a very large burden of trying to find evidence that will help the defendant. We are looking for all evidence that we can find to find the truth. But the defense expert obviously is looking for evidence that will help his client. And I think that it is important that that individual be given the opportunity to come to the crime scene and evaluate it as soon after the crime has been committed. The second major area that I want to discuss tonight is crime lab management, which is what I mentioned just a few minutes ago, being very important in maintaining the quality in criminalistic services. Today, it is the responsibility of the crime lab manager to get the most work out of the lab unit without sacrificing quality while maintaining a high morale with that unit. It appears to be an impossible task, doesn't it? Get the most out of you, the highest quality, and still maintain your morale. Well, the problems that I see in crime lab management today are basically the lab leaders are poorly trained in management. They're scientists primarily, they're managers second. And that's something that I think is going to have to improve in the future. We also see sworn personnel as lab managers that if they could stay on the job for a period of time, they might do a good job, but they keep rotating them in and out. Or, as I mentioned earlier, they happen to be the area where they put the dinosaurs, where they put the people that are ready to retire, where they put the people that they feel will do the least amount of harm. And this is not good for consistency in management of a crime laboratory. Prioritization of cases is very important in crime lab management. We seem to be inundated with cases involving drinking driver evidence and drug abuse evidence. And we spend all our time doing dope and doing alcohol, and the major case evidence goes undone or is not done in a timely manner. We need to prioritize our cases better. Generalist staffing of laboratories versus specialist staffing of laboratories. And this is a sore point with a lot of people, even in our own laboratory. We have people that want to be specialists. They want to work in one area. And listening today to an individual talking about hairs and the complications, the complexity of the examination of hairs, a comment was made. If you're going to examine hair that way, it has to be a full-time job. Well, that may be true. But what I'm telling you is the fact is this, that I think that one of our problems today is that we have people who are specializing without having had the benefit of having become generalists first. You need to be a generalist first and then go into specialization, because otherwise you do not see the total picture, and there's a tendency to overlook a lot of evidence that can be of value in an investigation. If you send a hair specialist out to examine a crime scene for hairs, he may very well overlook important firearms evidence or important blood evidence. So you need to have that total concept before you can actually become a specialist. And I have nothing against specialization. I think it's here and it's needed. We need to establish a minimum work output standards. As I indicated earlier, you know, got to get the most out of the laboratory. You've got to make sure that everybody is doing the most that they can do, but you've got to have standards. Examples, how many drug cases can an individual do a month? How many document cases can they do? Lack of quality assurance programs. Although this is becoming more prevalent in our laboratories today, you need to have that in order to ensure quality in criminalistics operations. There is a tremendous resistance to regionalizing and consolidating laboratories. Why can't we combine the LA Sheriff's Crime Laboratory with the LA City Crime Laboratory? Can anybody give me a good reason? Pool sources, resources, other than political, other than power, other than control. In these days when we are very limited in our resources, we need to look at these things more closely. Crime laboratory managers don't want to give up their powerful positions. That's very bad. Quality of technical staff. I talked to Jack Cadman about this. He's been in education now for a period of time. And it's the first time that Jack was very reserved in giving me his opinions. I have been an instructor in criminalistics part-time and in evidence technology for over 20 years. And one of the things that bothers me today is that the people that are going into criminalistic programs, first of all, have no verbal skills. And on top of that, have no written skills. They can't express themselves in a written form or in a verbal form. And that really bothers me, because those are the two main things that an individual has to have to be in this field and be effective in the field. I think that through no fault of the individuals that are getting into the system, the primary and secondary education has not prepared them well to go into a field that is very demanding. Also, the forensic science programs need to be, if nothing else, made more uniform. There needs to be some criteria established so that the education process in the forensic sciences is better and more consistent. Crime lab managers need to find funding sources for crime lab operations. I know that Larry Regal has done very well in this area, and I commend him for it. We're going to have to start looking for ways of finding money to operate crime labs. User fees, revenues, donations, a more effective presentation of the budget. These are things that are the responsibility of the lab manager. We need to establish safety programs to reduce hazards in the laboratory, if for no other reason than to build the morale of the people that are working for us. I know some of you work in conditions that are very dangerous, very hazardous, and I know that you're not happy doing that. Something needs to be done about that. We now need to establish affirmative action programs and anti-discriminatory policies. We put on a program in San Diego concerning sexual harassment, sexual issues in the workplace that I think are going to play a very important part in the operations of the laboratories in the future, and have created problems in the past in laboratory operations. My final and last subject that I want to mention is crime lab proficiency. The quality of lab results is the responsibility of management. It can be achieved for the prosecution through the use of periodic blind sample testing. But the defense also can achieve proficiency through the legal process of discovery and through various astute cross-examination. Laboratories lack operation manuals, or if they have them, they don't follow them. There's a misinterpretation of the results that they obtain. Reports are poorly written. Notes are lack comprehension, or they're not complete. There's a lack in lab proficiency testing on a regular basis. There's a lack of participation on the use of out-of-lab proficiency testing. There's lack of formal training. Lack of certified personnel in such things as alcohol, toxicology, and there's going to be other areas such as documents. Accreditation is available to us now. I think it should be taken advantage of because it will at least identify for you the deficiencies that exist in your laboratory. And there is a lack of in-house training on an ongoing basis quite often. Now, what I've mentioned here may not apply to a large degree to California laboratories, but when you look at the laboratory systems nationwide, the things that I have mentioned here tonight, I think are very appropriate. In closing, I would just like to say that the realities of today are that funds are limited and will continue to be limited indefinitely. This fact does not have to create a major obstacle in providing quality criminalistic services if sound management practices are followed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe. Well, I think he got to all of us there eventually. Very well said, too. Well, this quiz is really building up. I can feel the tension mounting. Now, everybody probably has got a pretty good answer of who's going to be talking about the future. But, unless, of course, you two are Italian, you may not have figured it out yet. Tony Longhetti, we call him El Duce, we call him Kojak, but out there they call him the Deputy Chief now of the Forensic Sciences, which is a promotion, I understand. Not really? Tony is a graduate of UC Berkeley, 1950, and he's one of the rare people who found a job right out of school, went right into criminalistics. He went to the University of Minnesota, not the university, excuse me, the state of Minnesota, in their crime laboratory in 1950. He went into the Army in 1951. It does not say whose Army here, but he was in the Army from 1951 to 1953, and he was at Camp Gordon, Georgia, so it was probably the United States Army. At Camp Gordon, that is the crime laboratory assignment there. Then in 1953, he went back to Minnesota until 1957 when he was hired and created the San Bernardino County Crime Laboratory. He is twice president of the California Association of Criminalists. He is currently the president of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences. Our last speaker on the future of criminalistics, I'm sorry, Tony, we've run out of time. Tony Longhetti.
Thank you, Larry. You're right. We have run out of time because by my calculations, and they're on the tablecloth at the table I was sitting at, Jack Cadman took 15 minutes and Joe Orantes took 17, which adds up to 32, and therefore we're already 2 minutes over time. So thanks. And actually, it's probably really the way I feel because trying to talk about the future is a rather difficult task and perhaps an almost hopeless task. Incidentally, the subtitle for the evening's program that was conjured up, I think, maybe by Sandy Wersema. Maybe Hiram Evans might have had a hand in. I don't know if it was subtitled The Manny Moe and Jack Show. And I think it's obvious who Jack would be under those definitions. Now, Manny is often a shortened version of a Hispanic name, so that has to be the other guy over here. And obviously there's Mo of me than there is of those two, so that's Manny, Mo, and Jack. Also, when I walked in, to top it all off, I set my little case down that had my notes and some other material in case we really get short of time, which is not going to be the case, on the table. And Jack came up, set his gin and tonic down, and spilled it. And literally, I picked up my case and poured out about a half of a gin and tonic and about 3 ice cubes. So it's a little soggy. You know, if you were to look in a dictionary, as most of you know and have done, and try to find criminalist and criminalistics, you'd have difficulty finding it. And if you did find it, as often as not, it would be defined incorrectly, at least incorrectly from my perspective. And the same thing is true of the word futurist or futurism. You will find it in dictionaries. I did find it in the two that I looked, but not defined the way that current futurists use the word. interestingly enough, you'll find it defined as a movement that began in the greatest of all other countries about 1910. And it was a movement that was concerned with the arts and getting away from the traditional aspect of the arts and conveying speed and mechanical things through the arts. But that's not the definition of futurist or futurism used today. Very simply and very pragmatically, today it's one who tries to look at the future and tries to plan for it. And probably even more pragmatically, or at least an objective of futurism, would be to try to improve the quality of the decisions being made today as they affect the future. Now, Joe Orantes actually touched on a lot of what I was going to cover, and that's probably my fault because I didn't make the lunch that was held last Friday to discuss our topic. The broad-based futurist, now I'm talking about the futurist who tries to look at the big picture, looks at the profound and rapidly accelerating forces of change that alter our lives, our society, our nation, and our social institutions. Now, the criminal justice system, which is actually, as most of you realize, a non-system. There is no such thing really as a criminal justice system. But the criminal justice system, if there were such a thing, futurist, would ask such questions as, what will be the economic reality in the future? How will budgeting be affected? What will happen in productivity? What are the major demographic changes with which to contend? What will the evolution of community values, relations, and social issues demand of the criminal justice system? And what are the technologies, both existing and as yet unavailable, that will be the system's tools? And then now comes the hard part, the broad-based futurist and the criminal justice futurist. What about the forensic scientist who's trying to look into the future? How will all this impact him or her? And right off the top, or almost near the top, don't expect any answers from me. Actually, I did stew about this for about 2 or 3 days. I made a lot of other things and trying to come up with some really clairvoyant, crystal ballish type answers for forensic science in the future. And it's very difficult to do. So really all I'm going to do is talk about what the broad-based futurist has said and what the criminal justice futurist has said based upon a 3-day conference that was held about 2 weeks ago at Kellogg West of Cal Poly Pomona. And then a little bit about forensic science and perhaps some of the things that Joe's already talked about. And then maybe in the question and answer or give and take portion of the program, we can come up with some other trends or predictions that we can all reach closure on. Let me go back to where I began with my comment about the broad-based futurist. Alvin Toffler, in one of his essays, traces what he calls a historical steamroller that began with the Industrial Revolution about 300 years ago, and which tended to kind of steamroller out the differences among people because of the standardizing impact of mass production and mass consumption and mass education and mass communications and mass entertainment and just all kinds of mass movements. And today, though, when you stop and think about it, the high technology society has us moving toward demassification. So that's a key word if you're into futurism. Demassification in this country. We're seeing a simultaneous shift toward heterogeneity occurring at many levels. The old melting pot, and this is not new, and some of you I'm sure have read about it, is being replaced with demands for black power, Hispanic power, Jewish power, and of course, Italian power. And actually, and it's a good thing I reviewed this, all this afternoon when it was typed by Juanita Jaronsky, who's sitting in the back, because she typed in, the melting pot is being replaced with demands for black power, Hispanic power, Jewish power, Italian power, and of course, woman power. And that's true, actually. That's true. And then you also have to look at production as another example of demassification. Instead of producing millions of identical objects, now we're making 58 of this model and 400 of that, followed by 17 of another. Or consider the workforce. Instead of millions of blue-collar workers doing routine, interchangeable jobs, we see a lot of specialization of skills and a more refined division of labor, and so on. And in the family, there are changes, demassification. In politics, there's demassification. In other words, to summarize, it's going to be a new kind, and already is a new kind of social order. We're no longer a mass society, but kind of a high change, high diversity, demassified civilization. Now, at this 3-day National Criminal Justice Institute on Criminal Justice in the Future at Cal Poly Pomona, the participants were representative of most elements of the criminal justice system, but were very, very heavily weighted in law enforcement. And that in itself is kind of a commentary, as an aside, because there were supposed to be elements of the court system and of the prosecutorial system, of the defense system, correctional system, and so on. Aside from the correctional system and the law enforcement part of the CJS, the others were barely represented, which is kind of unfortunate because these people don't get out and get involved like they should. Anyway, these criminal justice people were divided into several teams, and each team was responsible for identifying future problem areas and developing effective action plans for interagency cooperation in resolving those problems. And I'm going to very quickly summarize the work product of just one of those teams. First of all, this is one of the 8 or 10 teams, and just 3 areas that they identified in the future as problems within the criminal justice system, and they also tried to identify some action plans to do something about those problems. First, and this has been touched upon, and is not surprising, diminishing revenues and the resultant reallocation of resources will impact the quantity and quality of the delivery of criminal justice system services. Not a big surprise. Therefore, we're going to have to identify and recommend a prioritization of services to be delivered. And of course, when you start talking about prioritization of services to be delivered within the criminal justice system, or more specifically within the law enforcement and prosecutorial and court system, you begin to talk about forensic science. And we have to participate in interagency long-range planning, encouraging total community participation from the average citizen up to our legislators. The second point this team developed was social evolution impacts crime rates, community perception of crime in the criminal justice system, and the populations of jails and prisons. All of these are impacted by the social evolution. Therefore, we're going to have to provide factual information about the criminal justice system services. We need to participate in public education systems and 3 or 4 other action plans that I'll skip in the interest of time. And thirdly, and this I found kind of interesting, and it's borne out by some studies that have been carried out, the statement is that crime has a greater impact on the economy than the economy has on crime. During instances of depression or recession or inflation and so forth, when the economy is bad, crime doesn't necessarily go up. And when the economy is good, crime doesn't go down. Most studies indicate that there isn't much fluctuation. The reverse is really true. Crime has a greater impact on the economy than the economy has on crime. When you look in Miami and Dade County and look at the banks there and what they're doing with all the money that has come in from the narcotics that have come into the Miami and Dade County area, you begin to see that. And when you go up to Northern California, to Mendocino and Ukiah, and find out that it isn't so much the grapes that are are establishing a sound financial base for that part of the country, but another crop instead, then you begin to see that maybe that is, and there is a lot of truth to that statement, that crime has a greater impact on the economy than the economy has on crime. And some action plans for that, well, we need to publicize it. We need to develop and train resources accordingly, and we need to develop a closer liaison with private industry, with the banks, for example. You're not going to very easily walk into the banks in the Miami area and say, don't accept any of that laundered money, please, or don't accept the money in laundering. Not when it's in several figures, when it's comparable to Jack Cadman's, for example. Now, with this general background and the picture of our past and present that Jack and Joe gave, maybe we can indulge in just a little bit of futuristic thinking about forensic science. Consider, for example, the impact of demassification. Just at least briefly. Is there going to be more intergroup crime as opposed to the mostly intranation assaults and homicides we see today in gang warfare? Will there be intergroup crime, such as we see now? Turks and Armenians, as an example, and many others. And if so, we may see examples of different types of weapons in the usual shooting or cutting ones of the day, depending on what kind of groups we're talking about. That's a possibility. And keeping in mind the labor and the professional, as well as labor, if you want to separate those two,
moves toward greater specialization of skills, can we look for the same degree of greater specialization among forensic science practitioners? I think so. But at the same time, I think we can look toward, as medicine has, to creating a generalist specialist, in reference to the comments were made by both the previous speakers to the so-called vanishing generalist. I think the generalist will be, as is a family doctor today, a specialty, and a very necessary specialty. Or think about the shrinking resources problem, as again has been mentioned, and we have such visions as, hey, Joe talked about why can't those two large laboratories in the largest county in the state get together and form one laboratory? Well, the reasons are political. There was a commission established to study that problem that came back with a very sound recommendation. Gary can tell you about it, some of the other people who were involved. Very good recommendations, but it quickly got lost in the political shuffle, very, very quickly. I attended one of the hearings, as a matter of fact. But if you really want to start thinking futuristically, 2001 plus, about that sort of thing, why not think about regionalization and metro sizing of laboratory facilities to the point where you're serving an area from San Diego to Santa Barbara and from Catalina Island to Needles, at least with one core laboratory. That's certainly not outside the range of futuristic thinking. And you obviously have to think about more innovative funding, special districts for law enforcement, and even forensic sciences. A lot of jurisdictions are starting to think about setting up and creating special funding districts for law enforcement. You might even think about, if you're talking about technology, and part of the emphasis that this institute was on technology and primarily computerization and so forth, you might think about more breath alcohol rather than less blood alcohol obtained right at the scene, and with the concentration of the results fed directly into terminals at appropriate locations, such as the prosecutor's office and the court, for the time and money and effort that would save. But these are just some things that come to mind when you sit down by yourself and try to think about what might happen in the future, and they're not amazing, terrifically clairvoyant, or whatever. When you think of the statement, incidentally, crime has a greater impact on the economy than the economy has on crime, you begin to think about computer crime and white-collar crime and almost endless litany of criminalistic applications, maybe aimed at resoiling the laundered money, to coin a phrase. That's a double entendre, triple pun. Let me repeat that again for those who missed it. Never mind. This afternoon I was involved in an interview with the local newspaper on the subject of fingerprints and latent fingerprints, and basically on the quotation attributed to the current superintendent of the Chino Institution for Men, that where Jack set up the security system several years ago. She was quoted at a meeting Tuesday night of the citizens in the Chino Hills area as saying it took 2 to 3 months to run a fingerprint check and identify a person. So the local newspaper is doing a little feature story about fingerprinting in general and latent fingerprints because they're important in this case and so on. And at that particular meeting in Chino Hills, our old friend George Putnam, who lives in that area incidentally, stood up in response to that statement about the fact that it took 2 or 3 months to get an identification. And George stood up with the, I don't know if he had an American flag draped behind him or not, but he stood up and he pontificated and said, "Damn it, we can put a man on the moon. Why can't we take a fingerprint card, put it in a computer or in a black box, and in 2 seconds identify who that person is?" Well, the answer is really kind of obvious, given the time and the money to develop the technology and the system, and the technology is really here or around the corner. It could be done. It could be done. There's no question of that, given the time and the money. One of the statements that came out of this meeting at Kellogg West was, quote, "Almost anything can be accomplished in 20 years, unquote." And I think that's probably true, given the money and given the efforts and all, it could. And even that seemingly futuristic thing of putting a fingerprint card or the hand in a box and coming up with an identification in a matter of seconds is not that far away. So almost anything can be accomplished in 20 years. That's a byline of the future, of the futurist. And I'm just going to end by saying that actually there is no future. And I don't mean that from a real negative standpoint. Because strictly speaking, to get off the hook as a futurist likes to do, and I'm not a futurist by the way, all we have are the memories of the past as given to us by W. John Cadman, and the realities of today is given to us by Joe Orantes. What we have to do is create the future out of our imagination. If we have time here in just a few minutes, and we've run way over our time already, maybe some of you some of you can maybe throw out a few things there while we're discussing in terms of the things that you see happening in the future. And when I talk about the future, really, I'm only talking about 2000, and 2000 is only 17 years away. That's not really very long. Thank you.
Certainly sounds like a seminar that I was glad I didn't hear about. I got a teletype here of sorts that I'm supposed to read if I can. And it's a little garbled, but it comes from San Bernardino, where they don't know about the print track system apparently, or the Japanese system that does that already, Tony. Anyway, the year is 2001, it says. Tony Longhetti, despondent over recent developments in criminalistics, decides to hang it up after 51 years, and it's about time, it says. Having always wanted to visit his homeland, he journeys to Italy to rekindle the embers of his heritage. During his visit, a catastrophe occurs in the Roman police crime laboratory. Police officials suspecting terrorist activities launch a thorough investigation. An alert eyewitness provides vital information enabling a police artist to document this occurrence. Interpol is requesting your assistance in its worldwide apprehension of this subject, and they sent along a copy of this artist's rendition.
Did the author sign it?
Probably did that on county time, and they don't wonder. County mounting board, county pen, and a county typewriter that typed this, and that's why we're in trouble, folks, right here. Anyway, I just want to add a couple of comments on some of the things that were said tonight, and particularly in the morale. I find that it's that winning softball team that really keeps the morale of the laboratory up. Everybody plays, everybody wins. So I can understand why these two laboratory directors have these serious problems. And I don't know how I can help them with that.
Notice you went there.
I'll go on the game next time.
All right. Now we want to open it up to questions. I'll look out there in the audience, and if anybody here's a question from Ed Rhodes. He's probably been asked to ask this question. Ed?
No, I thought of this one all by myself. I'm interested in everything that we've heard tonight, but especially about the present and the future, and how it relates to how it affects us all. And you've touched on some problems and some ideas of maybe how we should reorient our thinking and get some things done. But if your laboratory is anything like ours, and your department is anything like ours, I have found that it runs not by a management system that tries to predict and anticipate problems, but runs by that all too familiar form of crisis management. And not a damn thing happens until you have a crisis. And then when you have a crisis, they throw money at it, they throw time at it, in kind of an unplanned way, because they figure that's going to solve the problem. Now, how are we going to be able, as criminalists, either at the bench or some level of management, convince the people with the ability to make decisions, that is not the way to get these problems solved. That crisis management has not worked in the past, and it won't work in the future. How can we address issues about better planning, better priorities at crime scenes, better training, better use of what we have, without creating all kinds of mass disasters and crises to get their attention?
I think that's an excellent question. Does anybody else have a question? Actually, that question took longer than Joe's talk.
I understood the question.
Okay, we have somebody who's going to answer that question.
If by convincing them that it's more expensive to do management by crisis than it is to do it by planning, you may be able to get them on the right track. Our department is already seeing this. Police departments notoriously managed by crisis. That's the way they've been conditioned. Something occurs, they react to it. They're beginning to see that it's costing too much money to do that. And you have to get on, or the laboratory manager, the laboratory management has to get in line with the rest of the units within the department to show them, hey, we're just like everybody else. We want to plan ahead. We want to make our operation as cost-effective as possible. But it's not an easy task.
That's a good question. This Institute on Crime in the Future had a lot of things in it that were things I could have done without wasting my time to hear. But there was one speaker who was the police chief of a suburban city in the Los Angeles area who I thought really had his head screwed on right, and made the comment that the day is past as far as he's concerned, and I'm sure not all chiefs and sheriffs think this way yet. When you can manage by crisis and when you can threaten the board of supervisors or the city council into giving me more men because something's going to happen if you don't, or we have the Olympics coming up and we've got to have more people. You know, you hear that down here, I'm sure, too, as well as in Los Angeles. And he thinks instead that you've got to get out and involve the community and the city council, in his case, in planning ahead for these sorts of things. And the same sort of thing, I think, would apply to forensic science. One of the interesting things about the demassification, if you want to look at it that way, is that the reason things are being done that have been done in legislation and so forth in the drinking and driving area is because of a special interest group, demassification again, namely Mothers Against Drunk Drivers. And you see that in a lot of other areas. Why have we done as much as we've done in sex offenses the last 5 years? Because of the women's rights movement. So those are stimulating things. But hopefully, I think what I'm saying is that we need to look for people like this chief and others to begin to think that you can't manage by crisis. You can't pressure the city council or the board of supervisors into giving you more resources simply by trying to scare the hell out of them. And rather, let's plan ahead and do it in a sound, sane manner. All I can say is I hope that bodes well for the kind of thinking that we're going to have at those levels in the future. I don't see it in too many places yet.
Had an inkling that maybe Ed had his own answer to that question. Do you have anything you want to add to that, Ed?
No, I think that we are seeing some answers in alcohol and some in drugs with a lot of pressure, but one of the areas that I personally deal with a lot is homicides, and there is no group of mad homicide relatives. They just are not a large enough quantity. Our management and our laboratory and department responds to the number of phone calls, and for every one homicide case, we got 100 narco cases. And homicide doesn't matter. There's not enough people jumping up and down about it.
Well, there are right now in one area.
Yeah.
Sandy, did you have a question?
Joe mentioned something that I've always felt is really important. He was talking about being a generalist, that he thinks it's really important to first be a generalist and then to become a specialist. It's something that I believe really strongly in, and for probably the first 5 years that I worked in Orange County, I was a generalist. Until I found that I was spinning my wheels just trying to keep up with the day-to-day publications in all areas. How can a person coming into the field today possibly be a generalist in all areas and still do outside work in any single area.
Is that directed at Joe?
Well, he's the one that mentioned it.
Okay.
Specifically.
You have to have a plan. You have to have an organized plan where when you take a new employee, you put them through a system of exposing them to as many disciplines as possible, and to give them the in-house training and the out-house training, as we call it, to qualify in as many areas as possible. People do have special interests, and I think they eventually should gravitate to those interests because they probably will do a better job. But it has to be planned, it has to be organized. We have in San Diego what we call the 5-year plan, which is not too popular, but what we're trying to achieve is getting people trained in as many disciplines as possible before we go to specialization.
Thank you, Joe. Question here.
The only question I have is generally, how many people find it that their crime labs are, A, separated from the main body of the police department, that they have to work under a police agency, and that maybe it would be better if crime labs were, in a sense, their own department, that a crime lab would be responsible for scientific evaluation of any evidence that could occur in a criminal or even civil or city matter.
Okay, who would like to answer? Did everybody hear that question in the back? They'll be in a neutral, independent department.
Exactly repeat it word for word.
He's got his watch on here.
From a historical point of view, this has been examined, has been proposed numerous times. I think the answer is very simple. We, as criminalists, stick too close to the bench to have much political clout. To survive in this world of taxation and debate over reducing the income requires that a person be occupied full-time just to stay afloat. I don't know of any situation where a crime laboratory has evolved and remained as a separate entity. Historically, probably the laboratory that was set up in Chicago as a result of the Valentine's Day massacres was far-sighted. This was 1928. Money was donated by citizens, and the laboratory was set up to be operated for $10,000 a year to be an independent agency of the sort that you described. The first year they ran $60,000 over and above the $10,000 promised. The next year they ran $22,000 above the $10,000 promised, and the following year they were disbanded and moved, sold out to the city of Chicago, where the laboratory came under the police department for a total of $25,000 investment by the city of Chicago. Historically, we can say that they were able to survive only when protected by the police agency. I'm afraid it comes down to a matter of political clout.
I think that's a very direct answer. It's very right to the point. And unless somebody mentioned a special taxation group, a foundation, I think that was Joe, or a special district where you'd have a guaranteed funding, if that is possible in this day and age, might make a neutral agency possible. But it's very true. And as an example, in our agency, our budget is about 10% of the total budget. And when we get an increase, it's not a big splash in the pond. If we get $200,000 or $300,000, it's not that much on the total departmental budget. But it would stick out like a sore thumb if it was just the laboratory or the forensic sciences budget. So being under that protective umbrella has its benefits as well as its negative aspects. Jim White there.
Yeah. over the last several years, the CAC, both in the north and in the south, has seen a proliferation of special interest study groups to perhaps meet the needs that have been created by the increase in specialization within the field. And I think these study groups have developed because the people involved have not felt they were getting the training and support that they needed in their specialization from the management and supervision in their laboratory. And my question is basically this: either today or in the future, where does the responsibility lie for maintaining a professional level of expertise between the individual's personal responsibility as a professional or the responsibility of the manager of that laboratory to allow that person to maintain a level of specialization?
Heavy question.
Ask him to repeat it.
First of all, management has the responsibility of maintaining the quality of the services that the laboratory provides. However, you as a professional have a responsibility of maintaining your expertise also. So it's really a combination of both. You have an obligation as a professional to keep your expertise up, but management also has the obligation of making it possible for you to do so, whether it be in-house or under special study groups. And that's the best answer I can give you.
How many people had to take the day off to come to this workshop this afternoon? As an example. I mean, there are, I think management is providing time, and some groups like the FBI have been providing, I think, a basis for pretty much paid up upgrading of areas such as that. But the basic educational responsibility for most professions lies with the professional, the person himself. He must go to school at night or take home study courses and things like that. And I really think that's something that's not done as much as it used to be in the past.
Just as a comment on that, though, in other professions are generally not run under civil service. So if a doctor or a lawyer increases his skills, it may mean more money and more incentive. What can you give somebody in civil service besides more work?
You're getting a 2% pay raise this year, aren't you? No, that's true. And I think it's for that reason that the counties and cities do pay for a good part of the expenses of educational programs.
Well, just to follow that up, though, hasn't it been in the last few years, as the money's available for crime laboratories is getting tighter and tighter, don't those seem to be the first things that are going? The money's available to simply go to a CAC meeting.
I think it's all the monies are going, as a matter of fact. It's not just a question of training money, but it's all the monies, as a matter of course, across the board. But it is exactly the subject that Joe talked about. It's a question of where are you going to put your money? And there is a time when you have to have the training because new areas come up. One of the things that I think some people are looking at is the manufacture of some of this equipment. For instance, in our purchase orders now for some of the new equipment we're buying, we are including in that a study program as part of the purchase price. So that at least the foundation of that particular instrument is going to be well established in the laboratory. So we don't buy it, as some labs that I know have done, and have a piece of equipment on the shelf for a couple of years and never be used, simply because nobody in the lab knew how to use it or would take the time to learn how to use it. Anybody else want to add to that dilemma?
First of all, I don't think you meant by the comments that the trend toward the study groups is necessarily bad. And I'm not sure that the reasons for their coming about are all the same for each study group. There are probably different motivations for all of them. I think the study groups have been probably the best thing that has come out of the profession in some time. Personally, even though I'm basically a generalist, I think they're probably the best thing. And I personally think that we really were at this point about 5 years ago, that the semi-annual
seminars could profit well by some kind of a format more along the line of the study groups. In other words, some kind of a similar type of format to the academy in many respects. Even though that tends to encourage the specialization, I think we have to face that reality. The other comment I wanted to make is that maybe there's some hope with a format that the Post has followed in tacking on fine money. And of course, we're milking fine money to death with all the good work, for example, Larry has done in that regard too. But there may well be, in some situations, Post money can now be used for training. I think some amplification or generalization of the way Post funding can be used might be helpful. But that's a tough political road to hoe to get in there and convince those people that some of that money or a new type of funding program ought to be made available. And I think that's an approach that could be taken and could be successful to some degree in freeing some of that money specifically for forensic science training, because that's what really gets people out to training programs. The reason I was attending this National Institute on Crime in the Future is because it was post-funded and the money was budgeted, and they needed 6 or 8 people to attend, and I was volunteered to attend because the money was there. Even a meeting that I didn't particularly care to go to, I went to. And we need to do that sort of thing, get into that kind of a milieu for forensic science. I think it can be done.
Get money to go to meetings we don't want to go to.
You have a question? No, but get in a situation.
Let me add one other thing, because it's been brought up. The idea of legislation and fine money. About 3 years ago, we, in Orange County, faced the question that Jim is bringing up as a real problem, when realizing that training money was not going to exist, and in fact probably would be the first part of the budgets that most administrators would cut out. And the section 11372.5 went through and was passed, and it does include a $50 fine for certain drug violations. That money must be used according to the language of the legislation, and we wrote it so it would have to be this way. Must be used for equipment and testing and education of forensic science personnel. We haven't really seen much of that money because of the fact there hasn't been much of that money collected in the first place. But this year, we got that amended to where that money should increase if the amendments stick. And this year also in our county, we have created, actually last year, a committee of lay people, of citizens, that are called the Forensic Science Advisory Committee. And they are well-intended individuals, some in law enforcement, some in the academia, some in scientific industry, who dedicate a few hours a month to come in and listen to our problems and make recommendations to the sheriff. Now, an elected official can just appoint his own advisory committee like this. So if you're working for a chief of police, he may not be able to do exactly the same process. This advisory committee this year has recommended that out of that fine money, we establish an account of some $20,000 to $30,000, whatever is appropriate, as a training fund for the training in the forensic sciences in our laboratory system. So this is the approach we're attempting to do. We don't know if it'll work, but it's at least an attempt. And I think it's a kind of a thing you have to do in this area that Ed has talked about, of planning ahead. Because nobody's going to come to you and say, oh, we just ended up, well, occasionally they'll come to you and they'll say, we have an extra position in some seminar. But normally that's not going to happen. Who had a question over here?
I have this question for all of you guys. I haven't heard many of you talk about automation in the laboratory or computerization. When do you see the impact, if any, of computers on our laboratory work or the laboratories in general?
Computerization, automation of laboratory functions is a way of having a more cost-effective operation. It's a matter of convincing the administrators that this is the way they should go. Fortunately, automation or computerization is already part of law enforcement. Somebody mentioned the little black box that put your hand in and have an instant identification. You may not realize it, but that is possible now, today. It's just a matter of being able to put something like that into operation for about $2.5 million. Now, I think that that is the way to go, and I think that those administrators can be convinced to go that way. There is, for example, I think in Tucson, Arizona, there is a one-person lab. No, it's not in Tucson, it's in Tempe, Arizona, I believe. A one-person lab that has a GCMS computerized. And they do all of their narcotics, and most of the work that's done in that laboratory is done by one person only because they have the automation. Otherwise, they would have to hire 3 bodies or 4 bodies. It's cheaper to get equipment than it is to get bodies.
I think the classic example of that was a presentation made at Jack's retirement. Jack retired, as you know, from Orange County in 1976, and Sheriff Music, that was Jack's boss most of those years, made a statement that I think addresses this exactly. He said that he calculated it out, that if all the justifications Jack made, every time he'd come in with an automated instrument, Sheriff, if we buy this instrument, it will save us 0.8 man days a day, or 7/10 of a man year. That if he hadn't bought any of this equipment for Jack and just hired the people instead, there would have been 378 criminalists in that laboratory up there. So automation, I think, and computerization has been with us a long time, and it's subtle in some areas and it's more obvious in others. The big problem we have in this county is the county government's fear of computers all over the county in little different systems. And they've established a centralized computer committee, and they have to review everything. And it seems as though their role is to detain, to place on hold, and to keep these things from occurring. And it's a constant ongoing battle, because they ultimately have to say whether or not you're going to get this computer.
In terms of costs, though, and I would agree with the comments about automation and computerization, one of the speakers at this symposium was R.E. McDonald, consultant on law enforcement and justice administration. Technology of the future was his title, and he just mentioned that costs are continuing to drop in terms of computers. In 1955, the cost of doing 10 million multiplications was about $65. In 1983, it cost about $1. In 1960, the cost of storing 1 million characters per month on a disk file was about $45. In 1983, it cost about 83 cents. Then he goes on to say the introduction of chip technology 5 or 6 years ago brought sharp drops in computer prices. 64,000 logic circuits could be implanted on a quarter-inch ceramic chip. And a few weeks ago, IBM announced commercial production of the 256K chip. All of that is by way of saying that some of those costs are beginning to drop, and that would put some of this more within the realm of availability in the not-too-distant future.
Rob, in answer to, in part, to what you said, speaking as a historian for the group, let me point out to you the fact that in 1953, when the CAC was beginning to be formed, we were thrilled with manual DU spectrophotometers. At that time, the infrared instruments were a dream. The manual plotting took, if one was really to go for detail, and the infrared spectrophotometers, which didn't come along for several more years, a period of 15 minutes to a couple of hours, depending on the detail you wanted in an infrared spectrum. We have been building on the philosophy that the more automation we could get, the more we could get from our existing manpower. And Larry's right as far as my justifications to the sheriff was something which he forcibly called to my attention. There's one important fact which I think there's a tendency to forget these days. The computer can do only what it is instructed to do. If can only be programmed after certain brain power goes into the preparation of the sample. And before that, the brain power that goes into the crime scene search, in my experience, is the factor that is most sadly lacking even today. There's been a great tendency to forget the trace evidence, or those things which take more time and I don't believe will ever be computerized, although I'll probably wind up eating my words if I live long. I will. There is an element here which is the most critical aspect of all. We should get rid of all those things which are the routine things, as far as possible, with the use of computers, with the application of the best in technology. But meanwhile, never forget that ultimately the simplest forms of physical evidence can make the biggest case.
Another question? We have one more. Let's have one more question, and then it's, I think Sandy's going to arrange for the bar to be open once again. She hopes so. Okay, the one last question is, where is the bartender, Sandy? Well, thank you for your attention. I think it's been a very enjoyable evening, and thank you, gentlemen, for your contributions.